Oh, that's crazy. Oh, I finally did it. Got it.
This is one of the coldest places in the world. The villagers mainly rely on hunting and fishing for a living. Last year was a tough one for them due to insufficient snowfall. Their fur earnings were dismal, and some families even lacked the necessary moose meat to get through the winter. Fortunately, as winter turned to spring, they managed to survive the dark days, and light returned to the land. The residents of Tanana village came out to check their remaining supplies, only to find the situation bleak. It is late January, and the temperature is still below -20 degrees Celsius. Stan has aged another year and is now 63, but his spirit remains ambitious. He wants to trap more fur, so he set out early in the morning to reset traps that had been idle for over a month. The steep mountain roads took him over an hour to navigate before he reached the trap line 10 miles away. However, the sight of his traps buried under snow disheartened him. Stan dug them out and reset them. Although it didn't take long, there are still hundreds of traps to reset. A daunting task. In Tanana, Moore has 38 sled dogs. After the winter, their dog food is nearly depleted. Moore wanted his daughter to help make a fishing device, but Courtney, being pregnant, refused. This displeased Moore, who thought today's youth are too sensitive. His wife had continued working in the first week after giving birth. Though frustrated, Moore said little and sought other solutions. The restless state of the sled dogs caught his attention, a sign of an incoming blizzard based on past experience. He went inside and turned on the radio, which confirmed a severe storm moving north at 48 kilometers per hour, expected to reach Tanana in 5 hours. Stan was caught in the middle. Fortunately, his son Joey, hearing the weather report and worried for his father's safety, set out on a snowmobile, which is 5 times faster than the sled dogs. He hoped to find his father quickly. Meanwhile, Stan noticed the worsening weather. The wind was much fiercer than before, and the dogs were shivering. He knew the wind from the south was a prelude to the blizzard, but continued working. Unbeknownst to him, the storm accelerated. When Joey found him, the storm's edge had arrived, and heavy snow began to fall. The dogs were listless, lying lazily on the ground. Joey urged his father to stop working and seek shelter in a nearby cabin built by villagers for emergencies. But Stan, growing more stubborn with age, refused to go to the shelter, preferring to finish setting the traps. In Alaska, playing it safe all the time leads to nothing accomplished, so taking risks is necessary. Seeing his father's resolve, Joey could only sigh, calling him a crazy old man. The blizzard was still a few kilometers from Tanana village. Moore and Thomas were building a fishing device, an old technique once relied upon by locals before being phased out by more modern fishing technologies. Last summer, Moore's fish wheel did not catch enough fish, and now they were out of fish with summer months away. Moore had to rely on the fishing device, but his clumsy son was not following his instructions, severely slowing down the project. Meanwhile, the weather worsened, and heavy snow driven by strong winds forced them to pause their work. Stan, at the center of the storm, found himself in an apocalyptic scene. He urged the sled dogs forward, trying to head home, but the fierce wind and relentless snow hitting his face made it extremely uncomfortable. However, a greater challenge lay ahead. To get home, he needed to cross an 800-foot-high mountain, a severe ordeal for the sled dogs. For their safety, Stan could no longer risk moving forward and regretted not listening to his son sooner. Now, he had to detour to a cabin in the woods. This route was not easy either. The fierce wind greatly exhausted the sled dogs. Stan was desperate. If they couldn't reach the cabin, they would freeze to death outdoors tonight. Perhaps his prayers worked, as he arrived safely at the shelter before dark. But the crisis wasn't over. It was going to drop significantly in temperature tonight, so starting a fire was crucial. According to an unwritten rule, the last visitor must leave some firewood. Fortunately, this allowed Stan to easily light the stove. He then took out some dried fish for the day's heroes. However, at that moment, he noticed the cabin was on fire. He opened the door, and smoke poured out. The stovepipe had fallen, preventing smoke from escaping through the roof. Luckily, he discovered this just in time to prevent a disaster. After the smoke cleared, Stan re-entered the cabin. found some spare material, fashioned an adapter, and reconnected the stovepipe, allowing the smoke to exit the cabin properly. After a busy day, Stan was utterly exhausted and soon fell into a deep sleep. The next day, the storm had stopped. Joey arrived at his father's home first thing, finding no sled dogs in the yard, which worried him as it seemed his father hadn't returned all night. Although the snow had stopped, the roads outside the village were still dreadful. Nonetheless, he couldn't worry about that. He just hoped his father was still alive. It wasn't until he hit the road that he realized how difficult the mountain path was. But the concern in his heart gave him enough drive. He silently vowed to find his father. In Tanana village, Charlie was skinning the last beaver. Although he wielded the sharp tool, he was grateful at heart because his family had survived over a month of darkness by eating beaver meat. A single beaver could provide 20 to 30 pounds of meat. Thankfully, the blizzard was over, and Charlie needed to replenish his stock urgently. At that moment, his son Bob walked in, now 21 and facing the difficult choice all villagers must make: leave the wilderness for a city job or inherit the family trade and continue this tough lifestyle. Although Charlie hoped his son would follow in his footsteps, he respected Bob's decision. To his relief, Bob chose the hunter's path. Excited, Charlie immediately assigned him a task to catch some beavers. Charlie's family had a 5-mile ancestral trap line starting at the Yukon River, just a few miles from the village. Even so, the journey was filled with difficulties. Bob's snowmobile got stuck in a snow pit, and despite his best efforts, it wouldn't budge. He then took out a shovel, cleared some snow, and by rocking the vehicle back and forth, managed to free the snowmobile. Meanwhile, downstream in the village, Moore was dealing with the aftermath of the blizzard. He had made a fishing device, and it was time to place it in the river. After clearing the snow, they faced a thick layer of ice. Thomas started the chainsaw and began cutting. The trick was to keep a layer of ice at the bottom, break it after cutting out a rectangle, and then place the fishing device. After some work, a rectangular ice hole was gradually forming. Moore cautioned his son to be careful, but Thomas's rashness triggered a mishap, and he ended up breaking the chainsaw. Moore was furious, lamenting that his son hadn't inherited his wisdom. At this point, they had to use another piece of equipment. An ice auger, typically used for drilling deep holes in the river, was not very precise and might jeopardize their plan. Thomas carefully operated the device, but eventually, the feared happened. The ice auger broke through the ice layer, and river water instantly filled the space. The group, with solemn expressions, had no choice but to accept the situation. Each person took a chisel, and using brute force began to slowly break the remaining ice layer. This method took 10 times longer than using a chainsaw. Meanwhile, Bob had already reached his destination and had cut 2 holes in the ice. But this was just the beginning, as he needed to set 18 beaver traps. The thick ice layer drained much of his energy, and he was exhausted. Accidentally, his ice chisel slipped from his hands and fell into the hole. In Tanana village, where there is no hardware store, an ice chisel is a precious item. Despite trying for a long time, he couldn't retrieve it and had to go back to ask his father for help. On the other hand, Joey had ventured 7 miles into the wilderness, but couldn't find any trace of his father. It had been 24 hours since Stan's disappearance. Just when he was at his most anxious, he finally saw his father in the distance. After they met, Joey inquired about his father's ordeal, and, relieved that the crisis was averted, chose to head home, with the snowmobile team slowly following behind. Bob returned to Tanana village and informed his father about the lost ice chisel. They went back to the river, and Charlie tried to retrieve the chisel with a shovel but also failed. At this point, the only option left was for Bob to enter the freezing water bare-chested. However, to prevent hypothermia, they built a fire nearby. Reluctantly, at Charlie's urging, Bob stripped off his shirt and dived into the icy hole. Despite his initial failure, Charlie urged him to try again. This time, Bob stayed in longer and managed to find the chisel. To prevent hypothermia, he quickly warmed up by the fire, dressed, and while warming himself, he complained about his father's harshness, questioning his decision to stay in Tanana village. Elsewhere, Moore and his group had finally cut an ice hole, and it was time to insert the fishing device. With only 2 hours left before dark, they needed to hurry. Unfortunately, the fishing device's buoyancy was too great to fit in the hole. In the past, Fishermen used iron nets which had less buoyancy, while Moore had used lightweight wood, unexpectedly creating too much buoyancy. The only remedy now was to add weight. Thomas drove back, and an hour later, they arrived with iron blocks. They threw 300 pounds of iron into the fishing device, which slowly sank to the river bottom. The device would soak there for a week before they retrieved it. The next day, Stan, back home, gave the sled dogs a rest and rode his snowmobile to check the traps. He stopped at the village's edge, spotting wolf tracks in the snow. This was bad news, indicating a constant threat from wolves, who are cunning and difficult to hunt. Thus, the battle between villagers and wolves could last a long time. Time flies, and quickly a week passed. Moore was finally able to retrieve the long-awaited fishing device. They cut open the ice layer again, removed the ice chunks, and set up a tripod to employ a pulley system. The fishing device, with the iron blocks inside, weighed at least 400 pounds, making it impossible to lift by manpower alone. Once everything was ready, Moore started the snowmobile to power the lift. The fishing device slowly surfaced and, as the resistance decreased, it swiftly emerged from the water. The group opened the cage door with anticipation, only to find a single large fish inside. This result was disappointing, as Moore had 38 sled dogs, and this lone fish was not nearly enough to address their food shortage. It was clear this method was not feasible, and he needed to find another solution. The next morning, the dogs collectively howled with hunger, making the food issue urgent. Today, Thomas planned to catch some beavers, but the problem was that their family had no fixed hunting spot. Early Alaskan natives fiercely protected their territories and passed them down generations, making new areas hard to come by. The family with the best territory in the village was Charlie's. Being a fourth-generation hunter, he controlled the prime lands, so Thomas had to ask Charlie for help. After hearing his story, Charlie agreed to lend Thomas a part of his territory on Fish Creek, which he hadn't visited in 2 to 3 years and might yield some catch. Thomas returned home, gathered some equipment, and set off with his sister Courtney, who was 3 months pregnant and had a craving for beaver tail, a famous delicacy. Fish Creek was 10 kilometers from the village and at the far end of Charlie's line. On their way, they spotted a huge beaver lodge, likely home to many beavers. Unfortunately, this was not the location Charlie had assigned them, so despite their desire, they continued on. After traveling another 5 miles, they reached their destination. Thomas was dismayed to find only a small beaver lodge there, realizing Charlie had given him a less desirable section. But rules were rules, and they had to accept it. The siblings drilled an ice hole with an auger, but the ice was too thick to set traps effectively. Courtney suggested they go to the large beaver lodge they had seen earlier, even though it was Charlie's territory and he wasn't present. Under his sister's influence, Thomas decided to proceed there, a move that violated the unwritten rules and could lead to conflict. But Thomas was desperate to care for the sled dogs and felt he had no choice. They quickly drilled another ice hole, letting it spread outward to form a rectangular pit. Thomas then found a birch tree and set up a beaver trap, covering it with branches to camouflage it as Charlie's usual method. They disguised the site, hoping others would mistake it for one of Charlie's traps. The next morning, Charlie was waiting for his son Bob to catch beavers, a vital activity for their family. He hoped Bob would continue the family tradition. However, Bob was resentful because last week, after losing a chisel, his father had forced him to retrieve it from the water. The rebellious son decided to strike today. Since he couldn't rely on his son, Charlie turned to his daughters for help. The eldest, 17-year-old Tanisha, enjoyed such work, and they set off together. Meanwhile, Thomas and Courtney came to check their traps before Charlie could discover them. They needed to leave quickly before being found out. Unfortunately, those with dishonest intentions didn't achieve good results. Although beavers appeared, they weren't caught in the traps. However, after checking several traps, they finally made a catch. A plump beaver was pulled from the water. Courtney was thrilled. Not only did the dogs have food, but she could also taste beaver tail. Since a dam usually houses over 10 beavers, Thomas wanted to catch a few more. He reset the traps and then quickly left. However, their actions violated the unwritten rules. This was Hunter Charlie's territory. If discovered, the consequences would be severe. The next day, Charlie and his daughter Tanisha were checking traps. Bob continued his strike, but fortunately, Tanisha was ambitious. She tried to lift a trap after breaking the ice, but failed due to its weight. Charlie had to step in and successfully pulled out a beaver, their first catch of the day, which pleased him greatly. They continued to check other traps, with Tanisha eagerly breaking the ice. Their efforts paid off as they caught another beaver, and Tanisha's joyful laughter echoed in the wilderness. Unfortunately, Charlie's good mood was disrupted by snowmobile tracks in the snow. They weren't his, and they led deeper into his territory. Normally, villagers avoided his area this time of year to prevent misunderstandings. Now, someone might be stealthily stealing his game. Furious, Charlie decided to confront the culprits. 5 miles away, Thomas and Courtney were checking their traps. They had caught a beaver the day before and were hopeful. The traps did not disappoint, capturing another beaver. Courtney chuckled with excitement, but their good mood was short-lived as they heard the roar of a snowmobile. Anxiously, they watched as Charlie rapidly approached. Escape was impossible. They could only wait for Charlie's questioning. Facing an aggressive Charlie, Thomas was visibly nervous and could hardly speak. His earlier bravado was gone, and his explanation was incoherent. He explained that they resorted to this because no beavers were at Fish Creek, and pleaded with Charlie not to be angry or spread the word in the village. Charlie's reputation in the village meant that any negative news could jeopardize Thomas's family's standing and their sled dog business, as trust was highly valued locally. Knowing everyone was an acquaintance, Charlie decided to let it slide this time, but he confiscated the beaver. Thomas and Courtney dejectedly returned to the village, but a mile from home, they encountered real trouble. A dead lynx lay on the ground, a fierce predator usually, now killed by another creature. They found wolf fur and many tracks around, indicating that wolves had triumphed. This meant a hungry pack was roaming near the village, posing a threat to children and sled dogs. Meanwhile, Charlie also noticed trouble. He found animal tracks near the traps and identified them as otter tracks. Otters mainly eat fish but also prey on beavers and can burrow directly into beaver lodges for a feast. This was a significant threat to Charlie's trapping efforts. He found otter droppings nearby with fish bones and parts of a beaver, confirming that an otter had eaten a beaver. Now Charlie had to find this otter. In the evening, Courtney cooked a beaver tail, a delicacy she had long awaited. She invited Charlie over as a gesture of apology. The beaver tail was delicious, and they enjoyed a pleasant dinner. Charlie forgave them, but sternly warned there would be no next time. Breaking rules would not be tolerated, as rules were rules. With that, the matter was resolved. Courtney mentioned the discovery of a wolf pack outside the village. As the village's best hunter, Charlie would not sit idly by. He planned to deal with the wolves. Every winter, Stan obtained water by drilling through the ice, but the cold weather had damaged his auger. Thus, he resorted to using a chisel, swinging it forcefully to miraculously create a hole in the ice. He then inserted a hose and used a pump to extract the water. When he returned home, his wife had surprising news. Stan's youngest brother, Chak, 15 years his junior, and whom he hadn't seen for years, was coming to Tanana village. Chak had always wanted to experience his brother's lifestyle, so he was arriving today. To welcome him, Stan decided to fix up the old snowmobile. After finishing, he headed to the airport. Tanana village's airport was very basic, with only a 200-yard runway and a 6-seater plane that landed a few times a week. Soon, Chak arrived, and the brothers finally reunited. Seeing how much older his brother had become saddened Chak. After exchanging pleasantries, they returned to Stan's home. The next morning, the wilderness survival training officially began. Stan had Chak start the snowmobile, an essential skill in case they got separated in the wild. Chak quickly understood the instructions and, despite being a novice, managed to operate the snowmobile proficiently. While following his brother to a trapping spot, a minor incident occurred. Chak overturned the snowmobile. The thick snow and lack of experience made it difficult for him to control it, but fortunately, no one was injured, and they continued their journey. 4 hours later, they reached the first of 50 traps, but it was empty, a bad sign. Stan decided to reset the trap, carefully trying to locate the buried trap in the snow. This was risky, and as he aged, the likelihood of making mistakes increased. Jack watched anxiously, worried about his brother. This primitive lifestyle intrigued him, but also filled him with concern. As they moved on to further experience the hunter's life, the sun gradually set, and then a new day began. It was time for Jack's visit to end. Before leaving, he shared his thoughts with Stan. Despite the beauty of the place, it was fraught with dangers. He hoped his brother would retire and move to Boston. Although Stan missed his relatives in the city, this place was his home, where he had invested half his life. His soul was deeply connected to this land, so he would not leave. Jack, while regretful, respected his brother's decision. He boarded the plane and left with Stan watching, his eyes filled with reluctance. A few days later, Tanana village hosted its most important annual event, the dog sled race, a tradition since 1934. Participants from various villages competed to prove the worth of their kennels. The top dogs could fetch prices up to $1,200 each. The Moore family, with a dog breeding history spanning centuries, had dominated this race for many years, making them well-known breeders. Now aged, Moore's children, Thomas and Courtney, were still celebrities in this arena. However, this year's race faced complications. Another village family, led by James, was ready to challenge their status. If he won, he could potentially take a share of the Moore's sled dog market. The timing was particularly opportune as Courtney, 4 months pregnant, could not compete at her best. With just 2 days until the race, both parties were making final preparations, while visitors from various places gradually filled the village, creating a lively atmosphere with constant laughter and cheer. However, Charlie and the other hunters couldn't share in the joy, troubled by a wolf pack that had been lurking near the village in recent weeks. To ensure the race went smoothly, Charlie was determined to confront the wolf pack head-on. He tracked their signs and was disheartened to find numerous footprints everywhere, counting at least 20 wolves in the pack. At that moment, a terrifying howl from the pack's leader, a 150-pound gray wolf, echoed in the distance. Concerned for the safety of the village's visitors, Charlie decided it was time to gather reinforcements. James was fully committed to winning the sled dog race, and his dog seemed to sense their mission, training with exceptional seriousness. Even when one young dog fell and was dragged along, the team did not stop, causing the fallen dog to cry out in pain. James stopped and carefully carried the exhausted dog onto his snowmobile before continuing with the team. With 2 days left until the race, he was eager for it to start. Meanwhile, Charlie returned to the village and rallied Stan and his son to form a wolf hunting squad. The news that the pack might include up to 30 wolves alarmed everyone, realizing this would be a tough battle. However, thinking of the children playing around the village, they understood the fight was unavoidable. For centuries, locals had battled wolves and considered wolf hunting a rite of passage for young hunters. Joey, who had been unsuccessful in hunting wolves for 2 years, was especially eager to break his curse and earn the villagers' respect. The group discussed tactics, aiming to kill the pack leader to scatter the wolves, or, failing that, to kill several wolves to instill fear in the pack. To increase their chances of success, they decided to split up. The hunters set off with grim determination, knowing each would face up to 30 wolves alone, and the roles of hunter and prey could quickly reverse. However, ensuring the race's smooth conduct mandated building a secure defensive line. Stan and his son, skilled trappers, decided to start with traps, using rotting moose meat as bait and burying bear traps in the snow to await the wolves. Charlie and his son opted for traditional hunting methods, facing the wolves directly. They split up to track the wolves, and Bob soon found a moose carcass, evidence of a recent kill only 4 miles from the village. Knowing the wolves would return to finish their meal, Bob set a trap along the wolf tracks, designing it to tighten around a wolf's neck and asphyxiate it. After setting the trap, Bob continued his patrol. Back in the village, the final 24 hours before the race began, it was time for the last training session for the Moore family's sled dogs. However, Courtney did not appear. When Thomas went to find her, she opened the door, looking exhausted, and admitted she was not up to training and hoped her brother could help. Thomas felt helpless, as he couldn't ask his pregnant sister to exert herself too much. But this inevitably affected the training schedule, setting the stage for potential challenges in tomorrow's race. On the other side, Charlie was tracking the wolf pack along the Yukon River. Every few steps he would stop, intently scanning the wilderness in hopes of spotting them. Unfortunately, finding such creatures in the vast wilderness was not easy, and the howling cold wind only added to his sinking mood. Just then, he noticed a figure in the distance. It was the wolf he had been searching for. He immediately raised his rifle but realized the distance was too great. Mounting his snowmobile, he gave chase as the wolf sensed danger and bolted towards the trees. Despite the snowmobile's speed, the wolf was nearly in the woods. Seeing his chance fading, Charlie took a desperate shot after aiming for a few seconds. His expert marksmanship paid off, killing the wolf with a single shot. Only after confirming the wolf could not get up did he approach it. Touching the soft wolf fur, Charlie felt a mix of respect and sadness. Despite their adversarial relationship, he admired the wolf's admirable qualities. He wondered why this wolf was alone, but hoped its absence would serve as a warning to the rest of the pack. With just 10 hours until the race, Thomas, having walked the dogs, visited his rival James's house to gauge his readiness and perhaps unsettle him. However, James, accustomed to big events, simply smiled and stated he was ready for tomorrow's challenge. They jovially agreed to compete. At the village edge, Joey was checking traps, hoping to address the village's wolf problem. Upon arrival, he found wolf tracks in the snow, indicating a large, mature gray wolf that had escaped after breaking a trap. Frustrated by the near miss with such a cunning opponent, Joey decided to double up the traps, setting 2 bear traps in one spot, hoping for an unexpected outcome. As night fell, the scene shifted to the next day, when all snowmobile teams in inland Alaska were assembled, ready for the exciting race. Charlie had killed a gray wolf, delivering a strong warning to the pack. Under his watchful eye, the sled dog race began, starting with the women's division. Each competitor had to cover a 12-kilometer circular track with timing points every third of the distance. The fastest overall time would determine the champion. As the top seed and reigning champion for the past 3 years, Courtney was the last to start, determined to defend her title and uphold her kennel's value. Despite her confidence, Moore was worried about Courtney's condition, as she was 4 months pregnant and not in ideal physical shape for racing. Finally, it was Courtney's turn. At the countdown, her sled team, like unleashed wild horses, burst forward. Each dog was in peak form, complemented by Courtney's flawless direction, propelling the team at great speed. She passed the first checkpoint almost 2 minutes ahead of the current leader, positioning her for a likely victory. Moore and Thomas watched contentedly until an unexpected stop by Courtney. One of the dogs had crossed the line, potentially causing disarray in the team. Courtney had to pause to adjust the lineup, a significant setback. This dog, known as a swing dog, should have been removed from the team during regular training, which Thomas had evidently neglected the day before. Courtney pushed forward at full speed for the rest of the race, but the delay cost her. She finished in 57 minutes and 5 seconds, securing second place. Displeased, she couldn't help but blame her brother and stormed home angrily. The next day, with just 1 hour left until the men's race, the wolf hunting squad was on high alert, tracking the wolf pack's movements. Stan's traps, set at the village boundary, had unfortunately failed to capture any gray wolves, proving them to be more cunning than anticipated. Facing such a clever foe meant constantly adapting strategies. Stan reset the traps and moved on to check another location. On the other side of the village, Bob checked his most promising trap but found no surprises. Eager to hunt a wolf, he resumed patrolling. Back at the race site, a strong competitor had already finished with an impressive time of 57 minutes. With Courtney having secured only second place the day before, Thomas needed to win to maintain their kennel's top overall ranking, putting significant pressure on him. Thomas's turn had finally come, and he selected the finest dogs from their kennel, known for their fierce and valiant running. Even James, his competitor, seemed daunted. Snow began to fall, but it didn't affect the performance of Thomas's team. Cheered on by the crowd, Thomas crossed the finish line, temporarily taking the lead in the race, much to his family's delight. However, the race wasn't over yet, as James was the last to compete. Meanwhile, Joey was still active outside the village, ensuring the safety of the participants. The pack leader remained at large, and they had even stolen the bait from the first trap, which angered Joey. After resetting the trap, he moved on to the second location, where he cautiously approached something hidden in the bushes. It turned out to be a large gray wolf. Initially stunned by the sudden encounter, Joey was then overwhelmed with a huge sense of accomplishment as he realized the wolf was already dead. He approached cautiously, touching and admiring the wolf, celebrating the moment he had long anticipated. Having captured the Wolf King, he believed this would scatter the pack and resolve the village's problems. Joey struggled to carry the Wolf King back, feeling victorious. Back in Tanana village, it was James's turn to race. Aware of the challenge to beat Thomas, he was ready to give it his all. Sensing their master's fighting spirit, the sled dogs were eager to start. At the signal, they burst forth like tigers down the mountain, their agile pace greatly enhancing the team's speed. James reached the first checkpoint 40 seconds faster than Thomas, setting him on a path to potentially win. The Moore family watched nervously as James's team sped up, seemingly powered by an unseen force. However, an unexpected incident occurred. The lead dog had a seizure due to overexcitement, forcing James to place it on the sled. This cost him a lot of time, and with one less dog, the team's pace slowed. James finished in 58 minutes, 2 minutes slower than Thomas, allowing the Moore family to relax, having secured first place. Despite his loss, James's performance still earned the audience's recognition. On the other side, Joey had caught a large Wolf King, leading a very large pack, a feat not seen in years in the village. Finding his father, Joey presented the Wolf King. Stan was astounded, never expecting his son to capture such a significant trophy. Praising his son generously, it was time for Joey's coming-of-age ceremony. Charlie, as the most respected hunter in Tanana village, conducted the ceremony. With Joey looking on expectantly, Charlie presented him with a wolf tooth, officially declaring him a true hunter. At that moment, Joey felt an immense honor, having finally earned the village's respect. By early March, temperatures should have been a few degrees above zero, but an unexpected cold snap brought them down to -20 degrees Celsius. This severely impacted Moore's plans, as sled dogs are not well adapted to such low temperatures, requiring more energy and care from their owners. Just a week earlier, the Moore family had won the sled dog race championship, and it should have been a crucial time for selling puppies. However, the cold weather delayed these plans. Worse still, Courtney, 5 months pregnant, could no longer engage in physical work, putting a strain on caring for the puppies. To maintain stable operation of the kennel, Moore had no choice but to seek help from outsiders. He called LaVille, who was new to Alaska. Seeing his refined appearance, Thomas was full of doubts, wondering if he could be reliable. Moore took him to a small cabin, LaVille's new living quarters, but LaVille was displeased with the primitive conditions. Coming from the city, he was unaccustomed to rural life and regretted his decision. Nevertheless, he decided to give it a try. However, the biggest issue was that he had never cared for dogs before, and now he was tasked with looking after 50 of them. Thomas, seeing his clumsy efforts, could only smile to mask his embarrassment, already convinced that LaVille was not quite up to the task. On the other side of the village, James decided to seize the Moore's business. He devoted himself to caring for the sled dogs to make them more competitive. In addition to dog care, he had been the town's top lumberjack for many years. Due to the cold snap, the demand for wood was higher than ever, but he couldn't manage alone. His 15-year-old son, Francis, seemed the perfect assistant. James handed over the wood business to him. The timber yard, located 10 kilometers from the village, required Francis to move quickly to save precious time. However, an accident occurred when his snowmobile suddenly shut down. He tried to fix it, but failed and had to walk home. Francis had suggested vehicle maintenance days before, which James had ignored. Now, this problem had arisen, and James bore the undeniable responsibility. Hours passed, and James, worried, drove out to find his son. He eventually saw Francis walking home. Together, they returned to the snowmobile. James checked the problem while chastising his son for always damaging the snowmobile. However, the rebellious son disagreed, pointing out that the snowmobile had run 7,000 miles and was overdue for maintenance. Angered by this revelation, James realized his son had often been joyriding, contributing to the wear and tear. But arguing wasn't helpful. The priority was fixing the snowmobile, as the lumber business couldn't wait. Back in the village, James made a tough decision. He planned to sell 2 dogs to buy a new snowmobile for his son. The market was 90 kilometers north, requiring an overnight trip. The next day, James returned with a new snowmobile. Francis was energized, eager to chop wood. After several busy hours, he completed his father's lumber order but didn't stop there. Wood prices had risen to $400 per stack, and the town's biggest customer was the water plant, managed by Charlie. Charlie watched the young man hustle and informed him that his father had already taken the payment. Stunned, Francis learned that payments were typically made upon delivery. He had not expected his father to deceive him this way. He went to confront his father. At home, he demanded the money directly, only to learn the truth. James hadn't sold any dogs, but had taken an advance on all wood orders from Charlie, knowing his son would take the water plant's order. Indeed, the old are cunning. Disheartened, Francis realized he had borne all the responsibility and would continue to work hard. Silently, he vowed to leave home when he grew up. A week after the wolf hunting incident, Joey, now calm, was busy with work. It was early March, and the trapping season was nearing its end. He and his father Stan were preparing to close down their hunter's cabin in the forest. They had been traveling for an hour when the sled dogs suddenly stopped. Stan, now 63 years old, and the aging sled dogs were losing strength, particularly the lead dog Lop, who, due to a shoulder injury, could only lie down to rest. Eventually, Stan placed Lop on the sled, and the team continued on. Impatient with his father's delays, Joey decided to reach their destination first. Hours later, Stan arrived at a riverbank, the Taz River, which was showing signs of thawing. He used a stick to measure the ice thickness and felt uneasy about its condition. With no other choice, he took a risk. At his command, the sled dogs surged forward. They were intelligent and aware of the grave situation, exerting all their strength. Unfortunately, the thick snow slowed the snowmobile, and an accident soon followed. The snowmobile overturned, and Stan fell into the water. The photographer hurried over as Stan called out, restarting the dog team. With the dogs' efforts, the snowmobile and Stan were pulled out of danger. Stan was still shaken when he reached the shore, grateful for the loyal dogs that saved his life. He knew if he had been on a snowmobile, the outcome might have been much worse. 40 kilometers from the village, Joey had already reached a forest cabin and lit the stove. He waited anxiously for his father, and just when he was growing desperate, he heard the dogs barking. Soon after, Stan walked in with wet pant legs. Joey quickly asked what had happened, and Stan recounted his ordeal. Joey, shocked and unable to hide his frustration, criticized his father for being reckless at his age. Due to the low nighttime temperatures, they decided to postpone further work until the next day. The following day, they began closing up the cabin to prevent bears from tearing it apart in the summer. For sustainability, they needed to mitigate risks early. Stan applied bear-repellent liquid around the cabin and sealed the windows. After hours of work, they finally secured the cabin and prepared to head home. However, the temperature had risen above zero, worsening the river thaw and complicating their return. Experienced Stan decided to look for another way out. He ventured through the forest to the river, only to find the situation even worse. Reluctantly, they had to backtrack. Eventually, they reached the riverbank near where Stan had nearly fallen in. He checked the ice again while Joey stood ready on the shore. As feared, the ice was thinner now. Lightly touching it caused a large section to collapse, with the surrounding areas also looking unstable. Yet, they had to cross to get home. Joey decided to lead the way. He increased the throttle, and his snowmobile shot out like an arrow. Stan's sled followed closely. Perhaps it was their determination, but they managed to safely cross the river. Once ashore, they stopped to rest, sharing a smile. Living in Alaska, accidents could happen at any time, and risking their lives was a common occurrence. This time, their gamble had paid off again. They then made their way back to the village without further incident. As a new day dawned, Stan was busy repairing a broken snowmobile when he suddenly heard the sound of an airplane. There is only one flight a day to Tanana village, and this plane was not scheduled, indicating something was wrong. Stan, who is the captain of the town's volunteer fire brigade, rushed over to see if he could help, fearing an emergency medical situation in the village. Arriving at the office, he picked up the radio and heard bad news. Moore's wife had suddenly fainted and needed urgent transportation to Fairbanks for medical care. On a less urgent note, Moore and Thomas were dealing with a disgusting task they preferred to avoid: expressing the anal glands of puppies to maintain their hygiene and comfort. This unpleasant job was passed on to the newcomer, LaVille, the low man on the totem pole, who was dismayed as this was not what he had signed up for. However, to keep his job, he reluctantly performed the task. Perhaps as a reprieve, a heavy snowfall began, and Moore took this chance to teach LaVille how to drive a snowmobile. Thomas gave him some tips and started the snowmobile, dragging LaVille behind. The fast speed and the icy wind made it painful for LaVille, who struggled to keep his eyes open due to the sting and the minus 30 degrees Celsius temperature, feeling an urge to cry from the overwhelming job. Just when LaVille felt he couldn't endure any longer, Thomas praised him generously at the end of the lesson, warming LaVille's heart and bringing a smile to his face. He felt the job might not be too bad after all. After a short rest, it was time for the daily training session to keep the sled dogs in top form, especially with competitor James watching keenly. Moore could not afford to be careless, but he was frustrated by LaVille's clumsiness. Once everything was ready, Thomas led the dog team out from dawn, working non-stop, leaving LaVille exhausted. Yet as soon as he sat down to rest, Moore glared at him. The exploitation by the capitalist never stopped, and soon Courtney came to urge LaVille back to work. After preparing the puppies, Courtney also left for training, allowing LaVille a brief moment to relax and grab a drink, which Moore disapproved of, thinking LaVille was too lazy. When Courtney returned from walking the dogs, she was upset to find that LaVille was not waiting as expected, deepening the tensions between employer and employee, a common misunderstanding in such relationships. As time passed, Tanana village entered April, and temperatures finally rose above zero, marking the time for goose hunting. However, Moore could not participate as his wife was hospitalized in Fairbanks with a grim prognosis, having been airlifted there days earlier. With his wife's condition and James's threat to his dog breeding business, Moore had to entrust the kennel to inexperienced LaVille, who felt overwhelmed. Previously having only cared for 2 cats, he now faced the daunting task of looking after 50 puppies. With no other options, he could only watch as Moore left. In Fairbanks, Moore and his daughter Courtney were talking with the attending physician. It turned out his wife's aneurysm had reached a critical stage, a level 4 or 5, and required surgery. However, the procedure was highly risky, with only a 20% chance of success. This news was devastating and left them deeply unsettled. Back home, LaVille found himself overwhelmed with work. During a training session, one puppy escaped because the leash was not properly secured. Despite LaVille's calls, the puppy did not return, complicating matters further as he now had to find the missing dog. To make things worse, the snowmobile wouldn't start because he had forgotten to refuel. Left with no choice, he had to rely on a dog sled for the search, leading to a crash due to his inexperience. Meanwhile, Moore was anxiously waiting in Fairbanks. His wife had undergone an 8-hour surgery and was in a drug-induced coma. They would not know if the surgery was successful until she woke up. In the city, LaVille was still searching for the lost dog. Despite going far, he found no trace of it and was frantic, knowing that if the puppy encountered wild animals, its chances were slim. After hours of searching without success, LaVille considered fleeing due to his failure. However, as he headed home, he found the puppy had returned on its own, much to his relief. 40 hours after the surgery, Moore's wife had not yet awakened, and they had prepared for the worst. Finally, the doctor brought some positive news. She had woken up and regained full consciousness, but would need to continue treatment in Fairbanks for another 2 months. Hearing this, they breathed a sigh of relief. As spring arrived, signaling the end of the long winter, the villagers had been cautious with their meat consumption to manage food resources. Now they hoped to improve their meals as the migrating geese were returning. For centuries, goose meat had been a staple, especially shared during feasts and religious ceremonies. Last year, the migration lasted only 5 days, leading to a poor harvest. This year, they were eager, especially young Francis, who was now 16 and saw hunting geese as a significant step towards manhood. To increase his chances of success, he sought help from Joey, one of the best young hunters who had recently gained fame by hunting a wolf king, solidifying his status as an elite hunter. At Francis's request, Joey agreed to give him a special training session. The first lesson was hitting moving targets. Joey threw clay discs while Francis practiced shooting. Unfortunately, the first two attempts were unsuccessful. Francis was not used to the shotgun, which was quite different from a regular rifle. Joey encouraged him to take it slow and focus. By the fourth shot, Francis hit the target, regaining his confidence and improving with each subsequent shot. The next morning, a few geese appeared, signaling the imminent arrival of the migrating flock. The villagers set out for a fishing lake 25 kilometers away, adhering to the tradition of first come, first served at the hunting spot. Previously, Charlie was always the first to arrive, but this year he was thwarted by his unreliable son, Bob, who was late. Since the incident last winter when Charlie forced Bob into the water to retrieve an ice pick, Bob had become rebellious, unwilling to live this way. As the sun rose, numerous potholes appeared on the river, now a highway of ice, posing a significant risk to snowmobile travel, and Bob's tardiness only fueled Charlie's anger. In another part of the village, Joey was eager to depart, but his father Stan was not yet ready. For 2 consecutive years, Stan had slowed Joey down, which greatly frustrated him. Despite his reluctance, Joey could not voice his frustration, because the journey was too dangerous to undertake alone, and they needed to travel together. After an anxious wait, Stan was finally ready to leave, albeit an hour later than planned. Charlie thought Bob was still in bed, but in reality, he was busy chopping wood. After a long winter, their wood supply was nearly depleted. Recently, Bob had been contemplating whether to continue the family traditions or seek fortune in the city. Today's wood chopping was meant to reinforce his decision to continue living this way. As Charlie grew impatient, Bob finally arrived, late. At their meeting, Charlie's complaining deeply disappointed Bob, who just wanted to make amends for past mistakes, only to find the situation worsening. After their argument, they finally set off. Upon reaching their destination, Charlie's anger proved justified, as most hunting spots were already taken by others. Similarly, Stan and Joey had been searching for a good spot for half an hour with no luck. In a dramatic turn, both families found themselves eyeing the same spot, but it could only accommodate 2 people. After a silent standoff, Charlie suggested settling the dispute through a competition, to which Stan agreed. However, Joey disagreed, not wanting to waste time on what he saw as a trivial contest. He preferred to search for another hunting spot. Seeing his son unwilling to cooperate, Stan had no choice but to compete alone. The competition began with young Bob shooting first, hitting 3 out of 5 clay discs. It was then Stan's turn, and the experienced hunter proved more precise, hitting 4 discs. Finally, it was Charlie's turn. He needed a perfect score to beat Stan. Under pressure, Charlie excelled, hitting all his targets and securing the spot for himself. Joey cursed and left with his father. Meanwhile, in Tanana village, James had not yet departed. Knowing the fishing lake was crowded with hunters, he decided to head to a different location, the Squaw Crossroads, which was only half as far but much more dangerous because it was a marshland. Last year, his cousin George had drowned there while returning from a goose hunt. To prevent accidents, he refused to let his son Francis come along, which deeply upset Francis. After all his preparations, he had no role to play, and reluctantly, he went home. As James neared his destination, the journey became increasingly perilous. Fortunately, he arrived safely and began waiting for the geese. Meanwhile, Charlie and Bob, having settled their dispute, were among the luckiest, spotting a large flock of geese approaching. However, Bob's shooting was off, angering Charlie, who took hunting seriously. Their argument escalated, and in frustration, Bob decided to leave the area, tasked by Charlie to clean up the camp. At the crossroads, James tirelessly called out to the geese. His efforts paid off when a few flew by, one of which he shot down. His good fortune continued as a large flock approached, leaving him overwhelmed with targets. Decisively, he took a shot at the flock, knocking down a goose, followed by a series of successful shots, hitting every target. This was his best performance in years, facilitated by the absence of other hunters, which made the geese less cautious. Reflecting on the past when George hunted alongside him, James felt a poignant sense of loss. Living in Alaska, where accidents and the uncertainty of tomorrow are ever present, he prepared to return home with his day's catch, reflecting on the transient nature of life. At the fishing lake, Stan and Joey finally found a hunting spot, but it was poorly located. They had no luck in hunting, as the geese flying by were too high to hit. Continuous failures made Joey increasingly irritable, and the small shelter made it uncomfortable for two large men to squeeze together. After several attempts, Joey decided to go it alone and asked his father to head home early. After some thought, Stan accepted his suggestion. Despite the dangers of solo hunting, it was time for his son to handle things on his own. To prove himself, Joey rearranged the bait and built a smaller, better camouflaged blind. Everything was ready, and he just waited for the geese to arrive. As night fell, the next day dawned quietly. Joey, eager to prove his ability to provide for the family, was hopeful. Soon, several geese appeared on the horizon. Joey stood and shot, quickly bringing down a goose, but continued aiming at other targets. After the gunfire, another goose fell straight down. Joey had scored a double hit, which left him extremely excited. After his successful shooting spree, he had harvested many geese, enough to prove himself. Now he was ready to take the meat home, hoping his father would be pleased. Elsewhere at the fishing lake, Charlie was still hunting geese with precise shooting, always leaving a few lucky ones each time the flock passed. However, while picking up the geese, he noticed a terrible sign. The river water had started to seep onto the ice, indicating a rapid thaw. For safety, he needed to leave quickly, so he powered up and headed for the campsite. Unfortunately, Bob was not there and had not dismantled the camp, which infuriated Charlie. If he had to clean up the camp alone, it would take until midnight. Tired of his son's unreliability, Charlie wished he could catch him and teach him a lesson. Back in Tanana village, 16-year-old Francis was let down by his father and could not participate in the goose hunting, feeling aggrieved and resentful. Understanding his son's feelings, James found Francis as soon as he returned to the village. His explanation finally resolved the tension between them, and they happily went home. 30 kilometers outside of Tanana village, Charlie was angrily cleaning up the campsite while cursing his son, who had promised to do this task but had disappeared. To punish Bob, Charlie hung his son's luggage in a tree and then drove off, swearing that if his son did not want to inherit the family business, he was free to leave. When he got home and saw Bob was indeed at the house, Charlie's anger surged, telling his son to get out, which was exactly what Bob wanted, as he had been contemplating leaving for a while. On the other hand, Joey returned from hunting with 13 geese, enough to feed his family for a month. Seeing his son's great success, Stan was exceptionally proud, realizing Joey had truly become a top hunter. Their relationship grew stronger as they shared a smile. In stark contrast were Charlie and his son Bob, who had wavered for months and finally decided to leave. Before going, he sought advice from James, who had left the village after high school to attend university in the city. James recommended Prudhoe Bay, a lucrative place for technical workers in the oil fields, where salaries could reach $100,000 a year. Already certified to operate heavy machinery, this might be the right place for Bob. Sometimes, leaving means growing, and he was ready. The goose hunting season ended perfectly, with every villager returning fully laden. However, early May in Alaska brought bad weather. Usually by this time, the Yukon and Tanana rivers would thaw, allowing boat traffic, but this year's unusually cold spring kept the rivers frozen with 6 inches of ice, trapping villagers in the village and potentially leading to floods. In 2009, a major flood devastated Tanana village, causing significant property damage. While repairing a boat, Joey felt hungry and decided to cook a goose. However, he was infuriated to find his outdoor freezer tipped over with its contents scattered around. The residents of Tanana placed their freezers outside to save on electricity costs during winter, but in spring, this leaves them vulnerable to predators. Claw marks on the freezer indicated that a black bear was responsible. Normally, wild animals do not venture into the village unless they are extremely hungry and take risks due to the frozen rivers preventing them from fishing. Joey planned to inform his father about the bear sighting. Charlie was prepared for the worst, expecting a high probability of flooding this year based on past experiences. He planned to move some items to higher ground and needed his son's help. However, Bob had his own plans to leave for the North Slope oil fields, tired of his father's nagging. Before leaving, he wanted to say goodbye to Wen, but Charlie hoped he would stay to help through the crisis. Despite wanting to leave immediately, Bob knew his family needed him. So after much thought, he decided to stay and help. Meanwhile, the news of the impending flood reached Moore and Courtney. Although his wife needed care, Moore had to rush home because he couldn't leave the dog breeding to others. This meant potentially being separated from his wife, worsening his mood. In Tanana, Stan was also closely monitoring the flood situation while preparing for the sled dog training season. Just as he was about to take the dogs out, he discovered one missing, with blood and fur left in the snow and drag marks suggesting a bear attack. Stan, armed with a shotgun, followed the trail and found the dog had been killed and eaten, fueling his anger. Sled dogs were not only valuable assets, but also longtime family members. He vowed to make the bear pay with its life. Just then, Joey arrived and shared the news about the bear's presence, only to find he was too late. The bear had already attacked a dog at home. Joey's frustration grew as he and his father prepared a temporary alarm system using dried fish and metal sheets to create noise if the bear returned. On the other side of the village, Moore had just returned and immediately checked on the puppies with the rookie trainer, LaVille, receiving a positive response. With his house only meters from the river, a flood would be disastrous. Remembering the last flood that destroyed his dog yard, Moore was determined to move items to higher ground quickly. He called his son Thomas to help move valuable wood worth $500 from the riverbank. However, Moore's frustration with Thomas and Laville's clumsiness, exacerbated by his wife's hospitalization, made him more irritable than usual. By noon, temperatures rose further, and the water level was also rising. Meanwhile, Stan was alerting nearby villagers about the bear to prevent injuries. On their way, they spotted the bear but did not chase it as it ran towards James's house, where many sled dogs were kept, putting them in danger. The two drove quickly to inform James about the situation. Upon hearing about the black bear intrusion, James's face turned pale. He had many sled dogs in his yard, which would be easy prey for the dangerous bear. James swore to do everything possible to protect his sled dogs. The next day, the temperature rose to 20 degrees above zero, accelerating the melting of ice. 320 kilometers upstream, a village called Eagletown became the victim of a sudden dam break, suffering massive damage. This disaster was rapidly spreading downstream, not far from Tanana village. The village representatives gathered to discuss a response plan. The local deputy sheriff, Mark, chaired the meeting. He first identified several areas that needed to be evacuated quickly, then formed a search and rescue team for potential flood emergencies. After the meeting, everyone started to get busy. Tanana village has over 200 residents, most living within 100 meters of the shore. The evacuation was not just of people, but also of their valuables. It was a massive operation involving everyone. The village had over 20 vehicles, all deployed. Due to the large amount of work, gasoline consumption increased dramatically. Charlie came to refuel and discovered the bad news. The gas station's pump was broken, and no gasoline was available today. This was the only gas station in the village, leaving Charlie feeling desperate. Without the cars, the evacuation would be delayed, and a massive disaster loomed. At this critical moment, Charlie tried to fix the problem himself, checking if the pipes were frozen. After tinkering for a while and switching the pump back on, unfortunately, no liquid flowed. The display was correct, but the problem was unclear. Now he had to dismantle the machine to further investigate the malfunction. Meanwhile, more cars lined up for fuel, increasing the urgency. After some work, Charlie removed the water pump to take it home for inspection. Meanwhile, the flood was rapidly approaching, leaving little time for the villagers. Government officials arrived by plane to measure the river and urged residents along the river to evacuate quickly. Moore, as a village representative, guided the officials and assisted their efforts. He explained the upstream geographic distribution in detail. The officials invited Moore to fly with them to observe the flood's progression. Witnessing the alarming scenes, Moore felt a surge of fear, hoping the flood would not harm the village. Meanwhile, Stan went to the lowest point in Tanana village, where circular houses were most at risk of destruction from the flood. To prevent tragedy, they decided to move the houses to higher ground, a daunting task made possible only with the help of a bulldozer. On the other side of the village, James was moving the dog kennels to higher ground. While transferring dog food, he suddenly heard urgent barking outside. Glancing around, James spotted a terrifying black bear. He dropped the salmon and picked up a rifle. By the time he loaded it, the bear had vanished. James searched and eventually spotted the bear again. He shot decisively, and the bear fell. After waiting a moment to ensure it was no longer a threat, he approached and prodded it with a stick. Seeing no reaction, he relaxed, relieved that the menace to the village was finally eliminated. James felt a wave of relief and satisfaction. On the other side, Charlie returned with one last hope. He cleaned the air pump filter, reassembled it, and restarted the machine. This time, gasoline finally started flowing again. Vehicles quickly refueled and continued with the evacuation efforts. With everyone working together, the progress of moving was visibly advancing. By the end of the day, the villagers were exhausted. Meanwhile, Moore brought the latest updates. The flood was only 20 kilometers from the village and expected to arrive in a few hours. The villagers did not know how the situation would change overnight, but they were prepared and quietly awaited the moment that would decide the fate of Tanana village. The flood was soon to reach them, and in the face of such a natural disaster, there was little humans could do but wait. The river was already cluttered with dense ice. The smokehouse on the riverbank was the first victim, destroyed in just a few seconds. Just when the villagers were most anxious, good news arrived. The ice downstream was moving quickly, significantly relieving the pressure on Tanana village. Seeing the disaster moving away step by step, the villagers were sincerely relieved. Although the immediate crisis was averted, they still faced several days of hard work to move their belongings back. The next day, some ice still remained on the river, but Charlie and his son could not worry about personal safety as their home freezer was empty. They needed to fish to sustain themselves. The two were looking for the ideal spot to set their fishing nets. Although Bob had long wanted to leave for the North Slope oil fields, his father's reliance on him made him conflicted and worried he might never leave. They soon found a promising spot. With years of experience, Charlie was sure this location would bring surprises. Bob tied the rope to a tree on the bank, then gradually spread the fishing net into the water as the boat moved, finally anchoring it with stones. The net was set, and they planned to check it the next day. In Tanana village, Moore, with 2 assistants, was moving the dog kennels back to his property. His dog breeding business was currently threatened by James, and to maintain his leading market position, he could not afford any mistakes. LaVille, who had arrived in February, still hadn't learned how to work efficiently despite 2 months on the job. Moore also had other troubling issues to deal with. His wife was still hospitalized in Fairbanks, and his daughter needed to care for her continuously. Moore wanted to go to Fairbanks, but with the rookie assistant, managing the entire kennel was challenging. Therefore, he hired another worker, which made LaVille nervous. Clearly, he would need to compete with the new worker for the position, as the kennel only needed 1 assistant. But when he heard that the new worker was a 23-year-old woman, the long single LaVille was thrilled. Moore was speechless seeing his attitude change, and worried it might have been a mistake. He then drove to the airport to pick up Megan, the new assistant from New Zealand, who arrived on time. Moore had a bad feeling seeing her attractive appearance, as outsiders often have romantic notions about Alaska, leading young people to impulsively come here, only to be harshly confronted by reality. Moore hoped Megan would not end up like that. Back at home, Moore began introducing everyone, and Megan was overwhelmed. Although she had been to many third-world countries, this was her first time in Alaska. She had expected it to be more prosperous, being part of the United States, but found it similar to villages in India. Moore then introduced LaVille, who acted aloof, a potentially fatal attraction for an inexperienced girl. His plan worked out in an unexpected way. Not because he was particularly handsome, but because he smelled so bad it made Megan frown. She wondered how she would manage in the future. Although Moore was anxious to go to Fairbanks, he needed to ensure the kennel's safety first. He emphasized the need for caution, especially with porcupines in the summer. Porcupines have 30,000 quills, and if a dog inhales one, it can puncture internal organs and lead to death. Therefore, the moment they see a porcupine, they should shoot it immediately. Moore took out his shotgun to test the assistant's shooting skills. He placed bait 10 meters away and handed the shotgun to Megan, guiding her on safety precautions. After a gunshot, Megan missed by a wide margin, and her subsequent shots were even more off-target. LaVille couldn't help but snicker at her poor shooting skills, deciding to teach her a lesson. Under her watchful eye, he too initially missed, but quickly adjusted and hit the target with the next 2 shots, causing Megan to exclaim in surprise. She then began practicing her shooting. When it was time for Moore to leave for Fairbanks, he entrusted the kennel to the two newcomers. Megan was more concerned about hygiene than the potential threat of porcupines. Despite her suggestions, LaVille ignored them, having no intention of bathing. Megan devised a plan. They would have a shooting contest where the loser must fulfill a request from the winner. Seeing LaVille's smug expression, she secretly laughed, thinking him a boring straight man. The competition began with Megan shooting first, surprising LaVille by hitting the target. It was then his turn, but unfortunately, his shot was too high. Megan won the contest and was thrilled, finding rural life more fun than expected. However, her partner spoiled her mood by refusing to follow through with the request, citing repairs to the dog kennel as an excuse. Clever Megan thought of a solution. She fetched a bucket of water and tricked LaVille into entering the house to fetch something. While he was inside, she climbed onto the roof and doused him with water when he emerged. LaVille was speechless, overwhelmed with work, and saw Megan treating the place like a resort. He sensed that her departure might not be far off. In Tanana village, Stan was preparing his boat to travel to a fishing camp 20 kilometers north of the village, uncertain if it survived the flood. His 21-year-old daughter Caitlin, who had just graduated from college, was helping her elderly father repair flood damage. Halfway there, Stan realized the water levels were too high, and other resident smokehouses along the shore were severely damaged. They finally reached their destination, relieved to find the fishing wheelhouse safe due to its higher elevation, though the camp had not been damaged. However, after inspecting the property, Stan found the buildings were dilapidated and possibly needed rebuilding. Back in the village, James had no time to fix the damage caused by the flood as he had more pressing tasks. For centuries, villagers had collected driftwood as firewood, a time and effort-saving method based on first come, first served. So James needed to act quickly to gather the unclaimed driftwood. To increase efficiency, he needed his son Francis's help, but when he asked, Francis refused. The teenager, now in his adolescence, was unwilling to be ordered around anymore. He had always helped his father without receiving anything in return, and their conflict was escalating. Meanwhile, Stan returned to the village to pick up some equipment, but first, he needed his son Joey's help to collect some driftwood. Joey agreed willingly, feeling it was his responsibility as the eldest son. He set out upstream to secure a good spot, aware of his formidable competitor, James. Unfortunately, his boat suddenly broke down. Joey tried to restart it, but the engine made an ominous sound, likely a burst piston. With no other option, he resorted to using an oar. When he reached the shore, he tied his boat to a nearby small tree and waited for other villagers to pass by. Since Francis was unwilling to help, James had to rely on his own strength. Charlie came along, and the two men, both dealing with rebellious sons, shared a moment of commiseration before James went off to collect wood. On the other side of the village, Francis had his own plan. He wanted to secretly collect and sell driftwood to earn some pocket money. This 16-year-old tried to fix an old boat, but, lacking proper tools, he resorted to using tape to seal the gaps, hoping it would hold for 30 minutes. Using logs, he slowly moved the boat to the river. When he returned with a chainsaw, he found the boat filled with water, a result unexpected to him. He had to laboriously pull the boat back to shore. Worse still, he saw his father James, who, after failing to get help, had brought his 10-year-old son only to unexpectedly encounter Francis. Seeing his son engaging in business behind his back, James couldn't resist making sarcastic remarks, creating an awkward scene. Meanwhile, Charlie and Bob went to check the fishing net they had set the previous day. Having not enjoyed fresh fish all winter, Charlie was eager. However, they were hit hard by reality when they found the net missing. The two exchanged looks. A fishing net worth hundreds of dollars represented a loss they couldn't afford. They started searching downstream while Charlie scolded his son for not tying the rope properly, which frustrated Bob, who was tired of his father's nagging. Further upstream, James was busy collecting wood. For safety, he left his 10-year-old son at home and worked alone, missing Francis's help. Meanwhile, Francis was on the shore, fearlessly fishing for wood in the river with a hook, driven by his entrepreneurial spirit. 20 kilometers to the north, Joey had been stranded for 7 hours. He became anxious and uneasy, facing a night without food or shelter. Just as he was about to despair, he heard the roar of an engine. He waved his jacket vigorously, but the other party didn't notice him. Taking a risk, Joey climbed halfway up the hillside. Looking down at the steep cliff below, he suppressed his fear and found a safe place to sit and wait. Back at the village, James returned with some driftwood after a day's effort. He collected 50 logs, while Francis managed only 3. James was quite dissatisfied with his ambitious son. As the sun was setting, Joey was still trapped, his urgency growing as time was running out. Charlie and his son finally found the lost fishing net, caught with a few fish. Charlie was excited, faintly smelling the fish, but disappointed by the small quantity. Meanwhile, 5 kilometers downstream, Joey had been stranded on the bank for 18 hours. Thirsty and hungry, his despair was overwhelming like a flood breaking through a dam. Just then, he heard the sound of a motor in the distance. Joey stood up and waved. This could be his only hope. It was Charlie and Bob in the boat. Bob, with sharp eyes, spotted a person. They drove closer to shore and found it was Joey, tearful. Although he was rescued, his mood was still down. The accident had caused him to miss the chance to collect wood, and he was unsure how to explain this to his father. 10 kilometers downstream, Joey's father, Stan, was at the fishing camp, checking on the fishing wheel. For the past 30 years, he had used this wheel, but recent years had seen a decline in herring catches, leading many villagers to abandon their wheels. This year, Stan was the only one still using it. However, placing this 3-ton behemoth in the water was no easy task. Fortunately, his daughter Caitlin was there to help. The collective nature of fish migrations meant missing one could be disastrous, and with the river thawing late this year, they had limited time. Placing the fishing wheel in the water was just the first step. Positioning it was the most dangerous part. With the water temperature just above freezing, falling in could be deadly. Stan instructed Caitlin to be careful, but an accident occurred when she stepped into the water and disappeared momentarily. Panicking, Stan shouted for help. Luckily, Caitlin was a good swimmer and quickly resurfaced. With Stan's help, she got back into the boat, shivering from the cold soak. Aware of the numerous drownings in the river, they hurried back to the camp. The scene shifts to Tanana village, where dog breeder Moore has returned. His wife underwent brain surgery, and after more than a month of treatment, she will be discharged in a few days. During this period, Moore had to travel back and forth between Fairbanks and home, leaving the dog breeding business in the hands of a novice assistant, resulting in chaos. Worse still, his competitor James took advantage of Moore's absence to aggressively expand his sled dog business, increasingly threatening Moore's position. Faced with internal and external troubles, Moore became more desperate. 5 miles outside the village, James was walking his dogs, a daily training routine. He aimed to seize Moore's market position, with the quality of his sled dogs being key to his competitive edge. His efforts were paying off as the dog's condition improved, signaling that overtaking Moore's position was imminent. Meanwhile, Moore's household was filled with joy, not only because his wife Lorraine was waking up, but also because his daughter Courtney was about to give birth. A new family member was expected within a month. Courtney was due to report to Fairbanks the next day, meaning she would miss her mother's return home. Concerned about leaving the 2 men at home alone, she meticulously instructed them on what to do. Her wife's full recovery would need at least 6 months to 2 years. Courtney suggested hiring a temporary caregiver to help, a significant expense for their already financially stretched family. Thus, she proposed selling a few dogs. Moore was visibly disheartened by this idea, as selling dogs was not in his plans, especially since most of the puppies were just a year old and neither cheap nor of high quality. 10 kilometers upstream, Joey arrived at the fishing camp to deliver bad news to his father, Stan. Due to the boat's engine failure, he hadn't managed to collect any wood. Stan comforted his self-blaming son, suggesting they could address the firewood issue in the winter. Back in the village, Moore sought out Charlie to share his troubles and hear his advice. Coincidentally, James passed by and joined the conversation. First and foremost, there was no ill will among the villagers. They were merely fair competitors. Hearing of Moore's difficulties, James realized it was time for a full-scale assault. The next day, Bob was helping his uncle, who couldn't work due to a broken leg. This was tough work, and Bob wanted to finish quickly because he also planned to leave the village to seek his fortune in the city. But the more rushed he felt, the more mistakes he made. He snapped a strap and it violently hit his arm, worsening his mood. Frustrated and impulsive, he snapped the strap again. causing more pain and swearing. He firmly decided to leave Tanana village and told his father of his plans to move to the city. Due to the current workload, Charlie hoped his son would stay to help a little longer, causing Bob to worry that the longer he waited, the harder it would be to leave. On the other side of the village, Courtney prepared to go to Fairbanks to prepare for childbirth. Moore reluctantly said goodbye, knowing her absence would impact the dog breeding business. Sensing an opportunity, James prepared for a full-scale offensive to completely replace Moore as Tanana Village's top dog breeder. He planned to invest all his savings to fly to Fairbanks and buy high-quality dog food. In recent years, the shortage of fish had led many dog breeders to intentionally reduce their kennel sizes, making this the perfect opportunity for James. He needed an assistant, but his 15-year-old son Francis, currently rebellious, was unreliable. So he approached Bob. Tonight, he would go to Fairbanks to buy commercial dog food and hoped Bob could drive his boat 50 kilometers to pick someone up, positioned between Fairbanks and the village. Realizing this request was his best chance to escape, Bob happily agreed. Having resolved his immediate concerns, James initiated his second plan. He walked through the village to Moore's house and briefly inspected the dog kennel. Then, he told Moore that he wanted to buy 6 one-year-old puppies. This news deeply troubled Moore. These young dogs were the future of his kennel. James was clearly trying to undermine him. Instinctively, Moore refused the offer, but James played his trump card. He had $4,500 in cash ready to pay immediately. This put Moore in a dilemma because his wife's ongoing medical treatment was expensive. Selling the puppies would provide much-needed funds. However, the thought of selling to his direct competitor was too bitter, and he ultimately declined the offer. 10 kilometers upstream, Stan's fish wheel had been running for 30 hours. He went to check it, needing to catch 50 to 100 fish annually to meet his family's needs. Unfortunately, he found only a few whitefish. Disappointed by the diminishing returns each year and the effort required to maintain the fish wheel, Stan considered his daughter Caitlin's suggestion to shut it down. This was painful as it meant giving up a fishing method he had used for 40 years. After much thought, Stan made the tough decision to stop using the fish wheel, accepting that he was getting older and needed to look ahead. The next day, James arrived in town with 1,000 pounds of dog food. Soon, Bob and Francis arrived by boat. They loaded the dog food onto the boat and left Francis to watch it while the other two went to celebrate in town. The town, having discovered hot springs in 1902, had developed many bars and hotels around them, making it a bustling hub. The two men entered a lively bar, complete with attractive waitresses and pool tables, a stark contrast to the dull rural life. This solidified Bob's resolve to leave home, so he decided not to return. James was stunned. He had brought someone else's son to town only to lose him. Understanding Bob's firm decision, James agreed to relay the message back home. After bidding farewell to Bob, James headed back. Back in Tanana village, Stan returned from the fishing camp disheartened, worried about surviving the winter. Hearing that his father had closed the fishing camp, Joey was shocked to realize his father had truly aged. Now, he knew he had to take on more responsibilities at home. He would need to hunt more this year to support his family. Meanwhile, Charlie was still waiting for Bob's help, but James arrived instead with the unsettling news that his son had run away. Charlie was both amused and dismayed. He knew his son's heart wasn't in village life, but he hadn't expected him to leave so abruptly. Now he had no choice but to accept reality and wished his son a better future. At the Tanana village airport, Moore's wife finally arrived from Fairbanks. Seeing his wife, Moore's eyes welled up with tears. Though the days ahead would be tough, he was ready. As long as his family was together, he felt they could face any challenge. He was determined to improve their situation and looked forward to better days.